I am. Is that on? I'm Laurie Gehring from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I'm curious, Virginie and Ritu, whether you've seen transformation anywhere, because the obvious next question is, if having women participate is not leading to the kind of transformation you want to see, what does? Have you seen anywhere where there's examples of that? And I'm curious also overall whether, I know it's very specific to the location, but does urbanization in general seem to be making things better or worse for women?
Thank you very much. Do you want to answer that question? Joey.
I'm going to answer, thank you, Laurie. I'm going to answer the second question first, whether urbanization seems to be improving things or not. And I would like to recognize the work of Alice Evans from the University of Cambridge. She is currently doing research on how gender equality might be better supported in the context of urban areas for two reasons. The first one is because perhaps women have better access to health facilities as well as police or any kind of social supports mechanism, but also because there is a sense of greater flexibility for the division of labor in urban areas. So women could be having better facilities to take on traditionally male roles in urban compared to the rural areas. So I think I would encourage people to look at this research in more details. In terms of transformation examples, I'm sure Ritu will have many examples from India.
Not very many examples, but of course from this study, just very few examples where women have taken on, the role where they have gone to different wards and they have disseminated information about the techniques that they have learned. They have spoken to the local governance, regarding the lacking services as well as infrastructure and things like that. But there have not been very many cases, as I said. These cases they also became evident, and they also came out primarily because of the individual confidence of women, the kind of support that she got from her family, to come out and have a share in labor also at the household level. And also because, as I said, the team was extremely gender sensitive because they had been working on these issues. But because it was not a very strong component, addressing gender issues was not a strong component as far as their job description in the CERN project is concerned, they went in a very gender neutral way. But in the pilot intervention phase, when they got a chance, then they were they facilitated the processes in a gender sensitive way. They did, in certain cases, help in bringing down the barriers, having discussions with the family members. But because they were not, this was not a very important part of the plan and approach. So it just happened in a very in some sporadic cases, not in a regularly planned manner. So there have been such instances, and those instances do encourage us to say that had this approach been there right from the beginning, the things would have been definitely more encouraging.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's take a couple of questions. You were next. Yeah.
Thank you. Caroline Harper from the Overseas Development Institute. That was all fantastic. Thank you very much for the presentations. I know it's slightly artificial to separate out into different sectors, but there are different histories and different evolutions of the humanitarian sector, the development sector, and the climate sector. And so I think everyone on the panel has certainly worked across the development sector and could now be seen to be also working in the climate sector. And it would be really interesting to have your views on whether and how genders evolve differently in the climate sector as opposed to the development sector. So is there a difference or is there not a difference? Is it false to say that the climate sector was sort of late into the game on thinking about gender? If so, why? And can it build effectively on the knowledge that is held in other sectors and move faster? Just some perceptions on, is there a difference or isn't there a difference? And can we take advantage from what we already know elsewhere? And if so, how?
Thank you. Let's take 2 more questions. Sorry, there's plenty of questions over that side of the room. Okay.
From Imperial College London, Centre for Environmental Policy. And I found also very interesting all the presentations. Thank you very much. And my question is also linked to the previous one as well, on these issues on development and the difference with climate change. But also, specifically, I guess, the area of peri-urban areas, which for both climate change and development are most of the time left out of many of the projects. And when they are addressed, we know that there is a lack of mainly planning for these areas. So the impacts in these areas from both the lack of development and the impacts of climate change are even more strong, let's say. And I just wonder how much has done in this area, if you found also some of these particularities for peri-urban areas.
Thank you. One more question?
Thank you. Beatrice Mosello from the Overseas Development Institute. First of all, thank you very much for the great presentation and panel. Having been involved in the very, very early phases of this work, it's great to see this publication out and a great event like this one being convened here at ODI. My question is related to the participatory approach that you've adopted in the project. And I was curious to know to what extent you've involved, besides the local governments and the municipalities, service providers. That can be formal service providers, like, for example, water utilities, but also informal service providers. I'm currently conducting some research on Haiti, and in Port-au-Prince, the capital city, the services of water and sanitation to the poorest, in particular, to the poorest people in some of the urban areas, some of the neighborhoods of the city, are provided by informal providers, can be individuals, even local gangs sometimes. So I was wondering to what extent these key actors to bring about transformation have been involved in this project, but more generally in your experience in approaches for resilience in urban areas. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got 3 excellent questions there. One around the differences between development and climate change and the role that gender plays. Second one around looking at the issues in the peri-urban areas. And then the final one around this participatory approach and the bringing in the informal actors. So who would like to go? Shall I ask across the panel? Andrew?
Sure. I'm going to take a slightly oblique shot at Caroline's question. I think since, if you like, social analysts have been working on climate, I think there has been an attempt to take gender on board. I think the results often haven't had a lot of kind of sociological depth, if you like. I think there's been a tendency to look just at very simple kind of practical impacts and so on and so forth, not always. And then sometimes a kind of leap of faith towards asking projects to, in 3 years, transform gender power relations in a given environment, which obviously, is a good aim, but at the same time quite a big ask of a development project, particularly if it's over a large scale. So, my sense of this is that the big changes in social structures and power relations happen at different scales. And if they're happening at those scales, it will enable it in local environments where you can work. Just to give one example, the literature on the export sector, garment sector in Bangladesh started by focusing on the gender power impacts of individual income, but has moved to looking at the impact of women engaged in collective action in labour movements and so on and so forth, and the impact that has on citizenship. So I think there's a reasonable hypothesis that big long-term changes in social structures and gender power require those kind of transformational shifts in society and economy and that projects at the scales we work can work within that, but probably can't have those kinds of impacts absent that. And I think again there, I don't think I made this connection probably as strongly as I could have done, but I think the connection to the thinking about the green economy is important there, about, you know, the big transitions that need to occur, the huge transitions that need to occur at economy-wide scales in order to get us on the right path for emissions. And a question would be, can policies at that level have an impact on the change in gender power, if you like? So.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel like to?
Just to answer Caroline's question, there is a distinction from my perspective between the climate change sector and the more disaster risk reduction community, if I can call them this way. I found in the literature that the climate change community were picking up more on the literature from the social development on gender studies, more so than the disaster risk reduction communities, because there is still this emphasis on the emergency aspect post-disasters. And if we don't go back constantly to the pre-disaster, like the root causes of vulnerability, then we're still missing out on the reason why people are affected differently, including gender inequalities. So there's a tendency in the DRR sector that we are reinventing the wheel constantly, discovering that, yes, people are affected differently. And I found that in the climate change sector, this came better. But there's also a disconnect between climate change and DRR, which is a shame. And I could go on forever on this topic. But it's going, as Andrew was saying, the involvement of social development people helped bringing more the gender perspective, but it's still a long way to go.
Can I just add on that, Colin? I mean, I'm very hesitant to add to what others have said because they contributed to some on the panel, because they contributed to some of the literature on this topic. Clearly, good development is gender sensitive, and climate change has come along without being particularly development sensitive at times, particularly the mitigation side. I think in the adaptation side, we've seen, you know, as I guess sort of, you probably saw in the CBA meeting in Dhaka this week, a sort of awareness and a sensitivity of this. There are new actors that have come in on climate change, and that many of those have been the actors who drive and hold the finance. These are environment ministries in the north and the south. They're not development sectors. There are new investors coming along, investing in renewables, for example. So what's the kind of level of awareness for these new actors? I think if we look at it through the actor lens, we can start to see where the gaps are. And I think it'd be fair to say that many of the first generation green growth or climate change policies and plans were basically gender blind. I think I wouldn't say they were necessarily doing anything that's wrong, but I think they could have been gender blind and therefore falling into the trap of perpetuating inequalities that I highlighted earlier. I think we're shifting on that now. I think donors are certainly shifting on that, and I think, as you can see, climate change mainstreaming across sectors in developing countries into agriculture and energy and water sectors. I think we see the possibility of that really shifting. So we did a study at CDKN on mitigation, climate mitigation and gender a couple of years ago, which I think started to highlight these issues.
Rita, do you want to? No? Nobody's answered the questions on the peri-urban.
Can I just say, for your question on peri-urban areas, I was talking with CDKN colleagues from Latin America, and they were saying that it was easier for them to bring changes when they were working at subnational levels. And the peri-urban areas was, I think, one of the key areas where there's scope to bring about change and engaging with the local governments at this level. But I'm afraid in this research we focused at the urban level, and I don't have findings from that geographical setting.
Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I mean, in the introductory remarks, I was referring to this as a very diverse reality. In a lot of countries, any settlement over 2,000 counts in the census data as urban, but you may find that the livelihoods within it are broadly rural. So I think the important point to take on board is there's a tendency to go for a kind of stylised reality of a sort of urban informal settlement well within the centre and so on. But many of the urban realities, particularly where urban growth is happening now, are much more in the peri-urban space, peri-urban or semi-rural space that you described. So I think that is really important. And there are the issues in terms of environmental management and climate impacts are very different. So it's an important element, and I think one that isn't particularly well handled in either the rural or the urban literature.
Anyone else want to offer? No? And what about the question then on the participatory approaches, bringing in local governments and the informal sector? Anybody want to offer some thoughts?
To answer Beatrice's question regarding the involvement of informal service providers, when I went to Gorakhpur, I found that the roles of informal service providers was really strong in terms of waste management. But that opens a whole new world of power relations and vested interests that also is linked with the local governments. And I don't think we've really explored that dimension at all in the research project. I don't know if you have anything to say, Ritu.
No, there's not much actually that has been done in the informal sector. Of course, rec pickers, and they constitute a very important population. But even in the Essen study, it was not. It has not come out very strongly.
Yeah.
Maybe I can just add some thoughts then. I am aware of the Peru case study that was part of this 10 Things to Know research, and they were the ones who had the quotation about the participation as a sort of a good stopgap for not having the gender-sensitive approach. One of the things they realised as a project team was that, well, actually, that isn't good enough and it's not transformational, and that they have to try harder. One of the key things is, in some of the areas they're working in, there are large peri-urban expansion taking place. And in many of those cases, those recent migrants to those areas are totally dependent on informal service providers. For many of the services that the people who live in the formalised municipalities, there are municipal service providers providing those services. And we've just done a study in northern Peru, which was not one of the case studies for this example, which was looking at informal settlements that were promoted by the municipality because they wanted to take over some land that the army was occupying. But then as soon as the people had taken over that land, they didn't provide them with any formal services. And what happened was they're almost caught between the informal sector, which is monopolised and provides a service, and you can't buy a service from outside, and the municipality that stimulated them to move into this area, but then failed to provide them with basic services. And these communities are now struggling between these two very, very different and very powerful stakeholders. Before we move on to more questions from the audience, we have received a couple of questions from the people who are viewing online. And the first one is from, and apologies if I've got the names wrong, but from Naya Smith Cabo, who I'm guessing is from Africa. And the question is, how to ensure gender planning if you have a gender imbalance in the team? So if you've got a male-dominated team, how are you going to unpack gender issues? And then there was a second question from Ed King, and he's asking for more clarification around the issue between alcoholism and domestic abuse, and how does this contribute to undermining resilience? So if we can take those two questions.
I can start if you. Well, it's not because you have an all-male team that your project will be gender insensitive. You can have a very strong, powerful gender advocates, which are men. I hope. And Sam is the gender champion for CDKN, so he's the prime example.
I would add that, I mean, you also need to change the attitudes of men.
Yes.
And men might be the best agents
Exactly.
to do that. So.
Especially when starting difficult conversation about who holds power, as Sam was mentioning, who holds power, how to use power. And likewise, sometimes women, yes, are better positioned to talk with women about vulnerabilities and inequalities, but it really depends on the context. So I would say that from an institutional organization perspective, it's always great to promote more gender balance in the team when implementing projects, and or it's always also a requirement to raise the awareness of team members in terms of gender equality and promote more capacity building, trainings, and so on. So that's one way of dealing with this issue. In terms of alcohol and domestic violence, we had this discussion yesterday, and Ritu has a very particular perspective on this, but I'm just going to clarify why it matters for resilience. Well, because when, as a practitioner, you're working with local communities, let's say in a slum area, and you're coming in saying you need to adapt to the increased threat of climate change because it's going to affect your household, your resources, and the person you're talking to is facing on a daily basis abuse from their husband, or abuse from their wives, or abuse from their mother or fathers-in-laws. I think we need to be careful of what's the priority for people that we work with or that we allegedly support. And I think that when we touch upon questions surrounding domestic violence, we need to be careful of not perpetuating any inequalities that will keep women, because they are the primary victims of domestic violence, from accessing equal rights as their husband or male community members. But we also discussed with Ritu the fact that alcoholism shouldn't constantly be associated with domestic violence, but I let her explain this a bit more.
It is definitely, it's very strongly associated with domestic violence, but it can begin a series of different kinds of violences, I would say, you know. It doesn't remain confined to domestic violence, but it leads to, like in the case of Gorakhpur also, it added to the workload of women, the fact that they were not able to feed properly the family and things like that. And so the climate change actually aggravated these impacts. So we can't really divide, you know, alcoholism and also, if I'm making sense, I mean, and climate change, they're all connected, because it's the same person who is getting affected by this day-to-day problem, the impact of this alcoholism on day-to-day living, you know. At the same time, the climate change is is aggravating these impacts of inequalities and, of course, violence also. So it is, I don't know whether I'm making any sense, but it is, it's very difficult to understand as to why it is considered to be a separate problem. It's very, very closely connected. You know, it's interwoven. I mean, all these things are interwoven with each other. I don't know if I have been able to answer this question or not, but...
Another interesting fact from the Gorakhpur case study was that men are the primarily victims, I would say, from alcoholism, but also women were engaged in producing liquor. So it was also a source of livelihoods for many women. And it really shows how, what Richard was saying, everything is interlinked. And if you are making a campaign against alcoholism, okay, so how do we compensate for alternative livelihoods for women?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And as far as the first question is concerned regarding the gender balance team, I mean, just the presence of women doesn't bring in gender perspective. It's not necessary. And this is what we realized even in the Gorakhpur study, that in the climate cell, you know, ultimately 2 women had been introduced. But when I spoke with the stakeholders, they were very clear that just the presence of women is not going to make much difference, you know, till they have that sensitivity, that perspective. And some men, of course, would be definitely a better gender advocates if they are sensitive enough. So just the presence of men and women definitely is not doesn't say much as far as the gender perspective or gender sensitive approach is concerned. But as you very well pointed out, that we need to generate awareness and it's very important to sensitize, you know, men also on these issues, and very important because women also, they suffer with the same conditioning. That in fact in many of the FGDs in Gorakhpur, it came out that women, they feel that it is okay for us to remain confined to homes, you know, it's okay for us if we don't participate in these things. these are things that need to be taken care of by men. And so similar thoughts were even men had. So it's not necessary that just because women are there in the team, or less men are there or more men are there, that is going to make big difference, as far as the gender approach is concerned, unless this sensitization is there, that awareness and sensitization is there.
Thank you. So, a few more questions from the audience. Got a couple here and one over there.
Hello, Sarah Sandon from Practical Action. How important do you feel it might be to consider social norms within the household to to changing social norms in the society more broadly, and therefore affecting things like climate change? So, for example, if a family lives in a very traditional gendered, this is female work, this is men's work, and there aren't any shifts there, do you think that can impact on how a development or a climate change project might happen?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nicola Ward from Care International. I wanted to pick up on Sam's point about these 10 messages being an aid memoir and what are we going to do about them, because I feel like we do know these messages, we've known them for years, so why are we really struggling to address them? And so my question would be really to Colin about what Practical Action are going to do with the kind of evidence and the findings from this excellent report.
Thank you. And we've got one more over there.
Neil Bird from ODI, and I'd like to pick up on some of Sam's broader comments with an example. The 2013 Ghana National Climate Change Policy has 10 priority themes, one of which is addressing gender issues. So there is already a recognition within the policy narrative. Following the policy, a national master plan was prepared, which was costed over the next 5 years. And here's the rub. For the Ministry of Gender to respond to the climate change policy, it would require its annual budget to increase tenfold. So my question to the panel is, where do you see that additional public funding coming from to respond to the gender concerns associated with climate change? And secondly, do you see capacity within the public administration, namely ministries of gender, to respond?
Thank you. So we've got a question on social norms and whether you need to also be thinking about those and not just at the community level. There's a question about, we've been struggling to do this for a while, and what are we going to do with it, specifically Practical Action. And then this question about how are we going to finance the gender activities that have been identified, with one example from Ghana. So who would like to go first? Okay,
so let me start with Neil's interesting story from Ghana. So I think what we have to conclude is that gender-sensitive planning should not be an add-on to climate finance. It sits at the heart of action on climate change, and I think that's really important. It's not we agree our budget as the GCF or International Climate Fund in the UK, and then we sort of add on climate change afterwards. We put it at the heart of the policy, and I suppose Ghana, in a sense, is responding to that. Of course, there's a deficit in funding climate finance as a whole, and the gender-sensitive part within it, and that's the problem. It's not the gender-sensitive part. It's how do you bridge that gap, and that's the generic question, which you know very well, Neil, which is around mobilising climate finance. Where's it going to come from? Internationally, domestic resources, or private sector? It's worth then thinking at actor basis of those sources and thinking, well, is the GCF tackling this as the sort of preeminent centre at which? So how is gender-sensitive planning going in the GCF? I confess I don't know. I haven't examined it myself. The UK's ICF, I would imagine, I don't know if anyone from DFID here who can tell us, has thought this through. But if we're now talking to pension funds in the UK to talk about how they're building in climate resilience into their investments, that's a whole new set of actors who might be thinking about these issues. So I think that's the challenge. Does the public administrative system get this? Well, I suppose this report is not terribly reassuring in that respect. I still feel there's a general problem about who really owns this agenda. I think this maybe answers your question too. Is this an agenda that is owned by Practical Action or CDKN or DFID? And that's great, but that's not utterly insufficient and wrong. So who's pushing it, who owns it, who wants this? I suppose the way we did this research with partners from 3 countries in 3 continents who are bedded into their national context, including the issue about norms, whether that's responding to environmental or social behavioural norms, is reassuring. I think we deliberately in CDKN don't just do pieces of research in ivory towers. We want to do it hands-on. So I think there's a huge potential to integrate this into the way institutions behave, how they think through issues and how they integrate them into their budgets. But that doesn't answer your question about the here and now problem that Ghana and the Ministry of Gender Affairs faces. But I think there's a direction which this report can help us turn towards.
Thank you. Andrew, would you like to take the questions?
No, but I mean, it's a similar response on Neil's question to Sam. Ideally, money flows directly through budgets to districts with provision for gender action, and the Holy Grail would be direct access through the GCF or other means, which allows for that. I think what's implicit in your question, Neil, is that we're miles away, and I wouldn't disagree with that. I think the GCF does have a condition of accreditation that institutions have to have a gender policy. Sounds a bit like a tick box. Not sure it's gone much beyond that, but I guess that's a start. And again, obviously, the GCF is very thinly kind of populated in terms of its technical capacity. So there would be a need to plug in other support to make all of this real. So yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't disagree with the general kind of subtext of Neil's question, which is that we're a long way off being able to deliver money at scale through in a mainstreamed way to address gender issues in climate.
Virginia?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, the social norms existing in the house at the household level definitely are very important to address. But I would say along at the household level also, as well as the individual level, because of this conditioning, even women also suffer with certain, they also have the same attitude as men. And but it's very difficult to answer which is whether it should be dealt first at the household level or the policy and program level or at the society level. I think they all go together. Sometimes the policies and programs create that space, for having that kind of sensitization, creating a space for sensitization workshops, discussions at the household level, which can help women to overcome those barriers, and also help men, create that enabling environment in the house. And the same people actually, they are part of the community institutions, and they can create the same kind of enabling environment for women to come out and participate at the community level. So it's very important. It's very important to deal with things at the household level also. Yeah.
Virginia?
Maybe just to add to what Rita was saying, I think it introduces the broader question of the time frame that Andrew mentioned also before, the time frame of the project and the requirements from donor agencies, particularly when using the words vulnerability and climate change, when projects advertise that they are addressing the vulnerabilities of community, and if we want to be serious about it, it means essentially addressing discriminatory social norms. But that's so different compared to improving people's access to water pipes, for instance. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing, but it means also it shouldn't be the sole responsibility of practitioners, because it can't be. It has to be at different scales. It also questions whether we should fund or not projects during 1 year only. Or should it be 10 years, but then is this realistic? I don't know. But I think that's really important question.
Thank you. And just to respond, Nicola, I mean, two of the case studies in this report are practical action projects. So the project in Kisumu was a water and sanitation project. The project in Peru was a disaster risk reduction project. And one of the first things we learned when the researchers went in and started collecting the data was that, yes, those projects had almost taken as a proxy for good gender, a gender non-neutral, gender-sensitive approach, that participation was a proxy for that. And very quickly we realised, well, wait a minute, participation isn't a proxy for transformational engagement. And as a result of that, we've engaged both with the Peru teams and with the Kenya teams, trying to look at how those projects interventions were designed and what can we learn from that to actually then support better implementation in the future. And it comes back to that question that Caroline asked right at the beginning about we haven't really learned the lessons from development and we're repeating the mistakes under the climate compatible or the climate change projects. So within practical action, we have had a lot of hard thinking about improving our gender approaches. We've come up with some sort of basic minimum standards that all projects need to apply with, and those for gender and they're for climate change. Of course, the challenge is it takes a long time for good thinking in these types of fora to then filter down to project field staff on the ground and the communities that we're working with. But, you know, that's where I think we all play a key role because we can be those facilitators, we can be those catalysts for change and just trying to make sure that this gradually, you know, seeps down and does actually lead to change on the ground. And I suppose that's also related to that issue around working at the community level and working at the household level. Is there just are inherent time lags present in these systems, and we just got to keep on trying to really improve the whole system. So have we got a final couple of questions before we wrap up? We've got one here and one, we've got three more quick questions.
Thank you very much for that panel. It was it's a very interesting document that I'm looking forward to getting into. Sean McCabe from the Mary Robinson Foundation. I would be keen to know, Sam, you mentioned that the importance of, you highlight number 6 in here on having gender integrated from the outset. If we think about a green transition and a just transition, a lot of the climate action will be delivered under the Sustainable Development Agenda. And what I'm wondering is, what are the panel's reflections on how well the understanding of the gender-climate nexus is taken into account outside of the gender and climate goals within the agenda?
Hi, I'm Nipunika Pereira from Ricardo Energy and Environment. Just want to thank everyone for these amazing 10 reminders, because we are working quite closely with post-Paris implementation work, particularly relevant to the NDCs. And I think this is a very good reminder for us to keep looking into the work we are doing. But I have a couple of questions. One is mainly related to a project we were recently doing at looking at mainstreaming gender into international climate projects and programs funded by the International Climate Fund. And one of the key things that came back to us from the people we were communicating with and engaging with was that what are the tools and guidance that's available for people based on the ground in countries from the donor side to make sure that they have the ability to use them as tools when they are designing and implementing and also evaluating projects that are happening. Are there enough tools that's available, or is this sort of a misguidance that people are looking out for things that exist, or is it something that each individual organization should build within the organization? And my second question is probably to regarding a caste and a class point you raised. There is an interesting concept that's going around following the SDG equity called leaving no one behind. how do you think these findings can feed into that concept? And how do you think that they can move along together?
Thank you. There's one more question. Yes, at the back there.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. My name is Sonia, and I'm in the Gender Institute at LSE, and I'm studying gender and climate change. And I'm just wondering your take from your different organizations on the use of language within policy. So specifically looking at climate change migrants versus climate change refugees. So oftentimes in policy, migrants, when they use the term migrant, it comes with it this idea of choice and autonomous agency, and it's often sort of like tied and conflated to people moving for economic benefits. Whereas if they use the term refugee, it kind of has this emergency context to it. And so the policy adaptation planning that comes out of that and the programming then and resources that come out of that are very different. And both of those uses of words blankets over gender in very different ways, depending on the implications of like funding and policy. And so I'm just wondering in your specific organizations and where you've seen that language used, and also sort of the impacts of that language usage, because, yeah, I guess that's about it.
Thank you. So 3 excellent questions. One on climate change and the SDGs, climate change, gender and the SDGs. Second one around mainstreaming gender. Do we need more tools? And a question on how caste and class reflects on Leave No One Behind. And then finally a question on language and reflection in policy. So Andrew, if I could ask you to respond first.
Yeah, sure. All very good questions, all at quite a sort of high level of abstraction. The Sustainable Development Agenda, how well that takes on board gender across the full range of whatever 17 goals and targets, hard to summarise, but I think it will depend to an extent on the way that, I mean, the predominant language to capture social equity at the moment in that is Leave No One Behind. So having a strongly gendered view of that and developing a strongly gendered view of that seems like a positive thing to do at the moment, while that's still, if you like, to a degree in flux and being formed. I don't think there's any real shortage of tools and guidance. I think a lot of the tools and guidance from development are very clearly and easily adaptable to a climate situation. So I don't see that as a major thing that's holding people back. It's more, I think, intent and finance to a degree. But that's a personal view. The human mobility question is really, really hard. There are no, I think, good terms. There are no terms that don't carry unhelpful baggage in this space, actually. I wonder if in time we could talk about people who are climate mobile or the climate mobile or whatever. I mean, human mobility is about the best term to capture the fact that, I mean, I liked a phrase that I heard used recently of people beating a strategic retreat. So not absolutely forced, but just that, hey, you know, this is going to be too hard, let's look at something else. But clearly there are a whole range of realities, and climate often isn't the only driver. In movement, usually isn't, not always. So I think it's an area where we need better language, we need better terminology. I think have a sense of where that may come from, but I don't think it's out there yet. Thanks.
Virginia?
Yes. Quickly to answer Sean's question, I think the nexus gender and climate, it's still not understood at all. Except for a very specific organization, and Mary Robinson Foundation is one of the key leading agency in that perspective. In terms of your question about tools, there are so many tools available already. Just to name a few, UNISDR report from 2009, FAO latest report, the SGIA report that links more agriculture and gender, ECMOD from the perspective of the Himalayas to integrate gender into not only research but also programming. The Gender and Climate Justice website has a wonderful toolkit for mainstreaming gender in policies, but also the nexus between gender, climate, and urban environment, authored by Gotlin Alber. Also, toolkit for the Pacific context. There's so many toolkits existing already. And the latest from the UNFCCC guidelines on how to integrate gender in climate change policies. The only problem is that this document is 35 pages long, and when I'm supposed to forward it to colleagues at CDKN about, okay, this is what you should be doing, they don't have time to go through 35 pages and then pick up what could be useful for them. So I think I agree with you, Andrew, that's a problem of timing and resources. But also, I realized from my perspective at CDKN that the problem of timing can be addressed by the organization. As long as there's someone who can help mainstreaming better awareness and understanding of what gender means, it's still possible to use those toolkits, but people need to have time to do so, and people to help them to do that. And one thing we were also discussing, I remember with Kirsty Mason from DFID, was that when we were replying to proposal for research project, it was really helpful to have guidance from the donors about what they would expect when they say, we want your project to support women's empowerment. But what does it mean from the FIT's perspective, and how can we adapt as an organization with your understanding of what women's empowerment mean in the time frame of the context of the project that you're suggesting?
Rita?
As far as the tools are concerned, I mean, I would say right from the perspective of somebody, you know, who has been working at the grassroots level, Virginie has given a long list of tools and techniques, you know, which are available. I would say what matters, we have enough tools. We just need actually the right that intention, you know, to bring about a change at the grassroots level. I have seen that people are very equipped very equipped as far as understanding tools and techniques are concerned. But when it comes to actually facilitating, you know, the meetings, the discussions, then they are not sensitive enough, and despite the presence of so many techniques, despite the fact that they are so well equipped in terms of using those techniques, the lack of, it could be lack of patience, it could be some biases, you know, that one is carrying, lack of sensitivity. The things that you have learned doesn't get translated into reality. And those things which need to be, which are necessary, you know, for women to come out, to women to speak, create that enabling environment at the household level, at the community level, that despite the fact that there are so many tools, you know, at various levels, they don't get translated into reality, and those changes don't come about. So it's very important, actually, the right kind of facilitation and the sensitive facilitation is there. We have enough tools and techniques, you know.
So just to add on that, yeah, we obviously there's loads of tools. We've got that message, but they're no use if they're not, as it were, picked up and utilised. And in the experience of CDKN, I'd say there's three things that we've more or less heard those already. One is the intent of the organisation to deal with this issue of gender-sensitive programming. Second is have the systems to deal with it. So what are the systems you build into your organisation, the way it allocates resources and time. And third is the capability of the people to deal with that. And we've worked that through to a certain extent to I think, be in a much better place in CDKN than we were. So I think if we have those three things, then we can start to utilise the tools. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. And I've been monitoring the tweets, and literally in the last 2 minutes, I've had about 6 questions come in. I know there are a few more questions in the audience, but fortunately, we've actually got a little reception for everybody. So there will be tea, coffee, drinks, and cakes in the reception area next door. But before we go, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for everybody who's joined us here today, either in person or on the internet feed, tweeting in your questions. Thank you very much for some excellent questions. And thank you very much to Andrew, Virginie, Ritu, and Sam for making such an excellent panel. So thank you very much, everybody, and let's convene networking next door.